Good evening. You're very welcome. I'm Peter Dunn, and you're tuned into the latest episode of our new Farming, Food and Rural Affairs panel discussion show here on the Irish Inquiry Channel, simply titled Grassroots. So tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we promise to have a really interesting and hopefully an informative and a very information-rich show for you, and a special treat as we welcome our first guest from the United States. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you can appreciate, it takes a lot of backroom work and behind-the-scenes effort and technical prowess to get a program like this to air. So we'd like to thank the Irish Inquiry, Stephen, and all of the backroom team for all of their efforts over the past while. We're currently in episode 6 of season 1. We do have 2 more episodes of Grassroots planned for season 1, and next week in episode 7 we're actually going to talk about biodiversity. And as luck would have it, May is the Festival of Farm Biodiversity Month, and we're almost coinciding also with World Bee Day. So promise to have a very informative and hopefully an interesting program next week in the final episode of Grassroots then, just before the summer, 26th of May. We're going to talk with a gentleman who's doing some on-farm trials, and we're going to discuss issues around ag education. And that then will be a wrap for us on our first series of Grassroots. But we have many, many more topics to talk about, more discoveries to make, more wonderful guests to bring on the show. And we hope to have a second season for you at some stage in the second year of the Irish Inquiry. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 really great guests tonight. Our first guest from the United States, all the way from the beautiful West Coast state of Oregon. We have Dr. Peter Bellerstadt, who is a forage agronomist and who has his own show on YouTube, otherwise known as the sod father of the ruminati. So we're delighted to have Peter on the show, and I think it's 1 p.m. Pacific time, but so we're a few hours ahead of him, but we're delighted to have him. And from the no less beautiful Strand Hill, I think I've got that right, Strand Hill in County Sligo, we have Seamus May. And some of our viewers may be familiar with Seamus, really fighting a good fight up there in the northwest. So, ladies and gentlemen, we hope that you make this, at least for the next 2 weeks, a regular Wednesday night slot at 9 p.m. We'd like to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. And as we like to say here on the show, prepare the hot beverage of your choosing, tea, coffee, or not, as the case may be. But please do pull up a comfy chair, sit back, relax, and prepare to enjoy the next hour or so with us here on Grassroots. So, ladies and gentlemen, all of the intros and the housekeeping done, and what I'm going to do now is a little preamble just to ease us into the show, and then I'm going to move to our first guest. But we're talking tonight about cows and corporations. Now, contemporary discourse about food and farming seems to be driven increasingly by powerful interests and forces which are, more than ever, disconnected from farming, from real farmers, from land, from plants and animals, and from soil. And we hear much chatter about the global food system. We hear rather highbrow aspirations from many non-governmental organizations, such as EAT, such as the Food and Land Use Coalition, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, our friends at the World Economic Forum, of course, the World Resources Institute, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, all interconnected at the supra-national and UN level. And it appears that many, though not all, of the NGOs harbour a rather simplistic perspective on what are very complex issues and hold rather biased views on livestock farming. Power appears to be the currency du jour, rather than common sense born of connection. And in particular, cows have attracted special opprobrium as akin to harbingers of doom and agents of climate cataclysm due to production of methane by enteric fermentation, not, I might add, cow farts. So is this a fair and a just stance? Does it acknowledge as a legitimate and, in fact, an essential trade-off the indispensable contribution that cows and all ruminants make to food security, both directly and indirectly? Does it need a mature and a balanced discussion based on honest science to the best extent of current knowledge, rather than agenda-driven misinformation fueled by powerful sectoral interests relying on an absence of nuance? And at the same time, we see increasing corporatization of farming and food production, justified by, some would say, a convenient narrative of scarcity. So, with all of that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really delighted to be able to welcome onto Grassroots our first guest tonight, who is Dr. Peter Bellerstadt from Oregon in the United States. Peter, you're very, very welcome on the show. Pleasure and a privilege to have you, sir. Peter, can you tell us maybe, firstly, a little bit about yourself? For the non-farming viewers among us, can you maybe also tell us what a forage agronomist is? And then maybe, because we're Irish and maybe a bit of a UK audience, we did, if I recall, have one viewer last week from New Zealand. But can you maybe tell us then, to finish off, a little bit about agriculture in Oregon?
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Peter, for the invitation and the program. An agronomist is someone who studies soils and plant sciences related to agricultural production. Forages are those plants that are grown to be eaten directly by livestock. So think of hay, think of pasture, think of silage, and those are all types of forages. I also have minor in ruminant nutrition, which makes sense because that's how we convert forages into a saleable product, meat and milk, and as we'll hear, the byproducts or the fifth quarter of animals. Oregon has been our home since 1986, when I graduated with my degree from the University of Kentucky. Some of the unique aspects of Oregon are that it's on the Pacific coast. It's between Washington and California. I'm about an hour from the Pacific Ocean. We have a coastal range of mountains between myself and the Pacific Ocean. We have the Willamette Valley that's just to our east. We live in the foothill area on the western side of that valley. Then on the other side of the valley, only about 40 miles or so away, are the Cascade Mountains. And those are the highest points, all volcanic in nature. But Western Oregon, which would be that area from the coast to the Cascades, is only about a third of the state. And as you go east and cross those mountain ranges, rainfall declines. As you go south across the state, rainfall declines. The highest precipitation would be in the northwest corner. It would be classified as a temperate rainforest. Precipitation can exceed 100 inches a year. I'm sorry, I don't do the conversions well. And then you can go directly east from that point, cross through the coastal range, get to Portland, which is the biggest city. You'll be in the 50-inch rainfall. Go another couple hours east, you'll go through the Columbia Gorge, and you'll now be in 8 inches of rainfall. So in about 4 hours drive or so, you can go from over 100 to less than 10. We have glacier on top of Mount Hood. So very diverse ecosystem and ecozones. In the Willamette Valley, we produce a large part of the world's grass seed. We have some unique advantages over other places like New Zealand or indeed UK, where grass seed might be grown. We have a lot of high value crops. We have a lot of diversity, but they're all not terribly large. So the diversity comes with a diffusion, if that makes sense, that the biggest crops the biggest agricultural commodities are going to be things like beef, hay crops, dairy. Down the list, you're going to have things like horticultural crops that get shipped somewhere else, container plant production. We do have a lot of small soft fruits and orchards and nut production. And right now we have hazelnuts displacing grass seed on many acres here in the Willamette Valley. We have a substantial, for the U.S., sheep industry. We have a lot of seafood produced. We're a large state in terms of land area, but a small state in terms of population.
Oh, I mean, that's a wonderful, and it kind of gives us a nice rounded package and a nice description of what's happening in Oregon, Peter. And I mean, yeah, it's funny because I mean, coming from a sort of an Irish perspective, I mean, quite a lot of the states in the U.S. actually are bigger in land area than the island of Ireland. I mean, but I suppose Oregon would probably be, in population terms, kind of similar to ourselves. But that's a wonderful description, Peter. Peter, can you tell us about your a little bit about your journey then in terms of I suppose, your advocacy for ruminants and I suppose, ruminant-based foods and animal source foods in the diet. And, for people, because I think this is what we're trying to touch on tonight, for people who kind of decry ruminants as harbingers of doom, I mean, there are specific sort of physiological and metabolic advantages that they have. And I think a lot of that is, a lot of those points are missed by a lot of commentators. And maybe can you just tease out some of those issues in terms of your own journey and your own advocacy for ruminants?
Surely. I started back in 2007. The line goes, I was a 51-year-old balding, obese, pre-diabetic. And coming to understand some information that I got from various sources, I adopted a lifestyle plan which emphasized animal source foods. And 3 years later, I was no longer obese or pre-diabetic. And today I'm still balding. There's no miracle here. Sorry,
I
Peter,
had hope.
that was not a shot.
I was looking for some hope, Peter. I was looking for some hope.
Well, there is hope, but not for that. So,
Okay. Yeah.
but what that launched me into was a lot of informal research into human nutrition and some public policies and those effects over time. And what we come to understand is that starting in the 60s, there was a social movement against the consumption of various animal source foods, particularly beef, other red meat. Those became codified in our dietary guidelines in the dietary goals was a U.S. Senate subcommittee report in the late 70s. First dietary guidelines, an official report came out in the 80s. On behalf of America, let me apologize for its effect on global food policy because it has spread outside of our borders, unfortunately. And what we've experienced over the last now 40 years is a decline in the public health. So while it wouldn't be fair to say that the dietary guidelines produced that decline, it is fair to say that they didn't prevent it. And there was science then to argue against their adoption, and that science has only gotten stronger, whereas the justification for those guidelines has not. And as I say, a big part of this has been to advocate for lower and lower consumption of red meat and full-fat dairy products in the human diet. And of course, those are the primary products of ruminant animal agriculture. I've gotten to know a lot of the researchers and a lot of the clinicians who have been working to help people regain their health. And I've found myself in this position where I can help them learn about the wonder that is the ruminant animal and its essential role, not just in US food systems, but global food systems. And as I've been doing this, I've become increasingly aware of these narratives that are constantly thrown against animal agriculture, especially ruminant animal agriculture. And I want people to know that there's other information available. And if we were to consider that, especially in a more holistic way, from production through the effect on human health, that we would have a very different image than what we currently get too often from various interest groups and the media.
No, that's a really rich answer, Peter. I mean, if I can just maybe just going to mention your own YouTube channel, still on YouTube, and I've seen where you've have some wonderful guests on that channel. And I mean, I'm just thinking, just in terms of our own viewers this evening, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to find out, a lot about this particular topic, you can search for Peter Bellerstadt in YouTube. And Peter, there's some wonderful content on there, and really that's and I've used it. I've recommended it to students. I mean, almost in terms of as a resource pack as well. If I can just on foot of that, really sort of throw the question out there, just how important and I mean, I've used the term the global food system, but at all scales and all regions and biomes, just how crucial are ruminants, Peter?
Well, they're the key ecological link in converting the the dry matter, the carbohydrate that's produced via photosynthesis. Primarily, that's cellulose. And no vertebrate animal can produce the cellulase enzyme that's necessary to break those glucose units apart to make that energy available to us. So ruminant animals are this key link in the biosphere's energy chain. They do a number of other things as well. For example, they can convert non-protein nitrogen into highest quality protein for human use. They can take the phosphorus that, for the most part, in cereals and legumes and nuts is unavailable to humans, and make it available to us, as well as other minerals. They are a source of essential vitamins, so they increase the bioavailability of nutrients. They provide nutrients that aren't available from plant source foods. And that's before we ever get to things like ecosystem services, the value of grasslands, the requirement for ruminants to maintain grassland health, soil health. In many parts of the world, they are a principal source of wealth, and we have a substantial portion of the world's population that's dependent on a pastoral lifestyle. Most of the world's fertilizer that we use to grow the edible crops comes from livestock. The majority of that is going to be coming from ruminants. Over half of the world's farmers are still dependent on draft animals. Most of those are ruminants. And that's before we've gotten to the fifth quarter, right? But that's before we've gotten to wool and leather and the other co-products of this essential element of food systems wherever they're practiced in the world. And one of my points is that we can't feed today's world without ruminant animal agriculture, let alone the world of 2050. We've got to increase the productivity and efficiency of our global ruminant animal systems wherever they're practiced. And they're going to look different. There's, it's different cultures and different realities, but fundamentally those ruminant systems have to be in place and improved. And there's lots of details I could give on that.
Well, that's fantastic, Peter. I mean, yeah, so I mean, just to extend that then, I mean, we might revisit some of those topics later in the show, Peter, but because there's certainly a myriad details, and we can really do a kind of a deep dive in that. And you're probably familiar with the it's not a concept, it's a phrase, really, a catchphrase, and I think it's attributed to Russ Conser. And I don't know Russ personally, but he was the CEO of Standard Soil, I think it was, and he's attributed the axiom, "It's not the cow, it's the how," and you're probably familiar with that phrase. There's a lot we can touch on, Peter. Thank you so much for that contribution. We're definitely going to really follow that thread of discussion later in the show. Thank you so much. I'm conscious we have our other guest is joining us this evening, ladies and gentlemen, from the lovely Strand Hill in County Sligo, and it is Seamus May. Seamus, thank you so much for coming on the show. And Seamus, can you maybe just for the viewers, anybody who hasn't, seen you before, I know you have been on other shows on Irish Inquiry, I think on at least one occasion. Can you maybe just tell us a little bit about your background and what your current situation is? I think you're muted, Seamus.
Sorry, guys. No, I just had a little problem with my mouse, but you can hear me now, yes?
Yes, indeed.
All good,
no
yeah.
bother, Seamus. Yeah,
that's great. Listen, Peter, thank you so much for bringing me on, and thank you to the Irish Inquiry for bringing me on. Very impressed with what Peter just had to say. It's proper experts like Peter that we need and that need to be feeding into the political system. But of course, in many cases, at least in our country, in Ireland, these type of people tend to be excluded because they just simply know too much. My background and my work would be, quite different from where Peter is coming from. I would work very much in the area of political reform. Okay, sorry. Just bear with me 1 second. Yeah, I should be okay now. I have a very strong.
Yeah, I think you're probably you're coming through okay now, Seamus. Yeah, so carry on.
I would have a very strong internet connection here. I don't know what happened there. I just checked it and I'm on the correct one. So I don't know how much of that was missed or not.
Well, I got most of it, Seamus. So I think we're probably okay. You were talking about the area of political capture
I would do a lot of yes, I would do a lot of work in the area of political reform and political capture. I white collar crime, corruption, access to justice. Across a wide range of areas. And I also have worked over a wide range of sectors, agriculture and specifically beef being a few years back, I did a report. It was called Beer, Beef and Bread. It was a really, really good report, and it highlighted a lot of the macroeconomic issues facing farmers and primary producers. So therefore, I would be approaching this whole area sort of from a different angle than Peter. But I actually think that we would come together. Our two briefs would come together along the way.
No, that's fantastic, Seamus. I mean, thanks very much for that introduction. What I'm kind of hoping to do is maybe weave or splice together a kind of a thread and maybe just try and sort of extract some synergies there. And I'm just wondering, Seamus, you've done. I'm conscious of the report on the beer, beef and bread. I think I've got that sequence correct. And you looked at the beef industry, and I know we've seen significant consolidation, even reported this week. And I'm just wondering, Seamus, can you tell us a little bit more about that report and maybe work out towards the kind of the fifth quarter?
Yeah, well, listen, if I could just, before I maybe even go into that, currently I'm working on a paper, and it's a paper about political reform. And I've done quite extensive investigations and research into the various, the political establishments around the world and how they change. And what I'm going to say here, this goes to the very core, it goes to the root of the problem, not just in the agri sector, but across all sectors. And it is, 40 years ago, we did have a democratic, we had a democratic society, capitalist democratic. Capitalist has got a very bad name nowadays for very good reasons, because over the last 40 years, we have, we've had a mutant of democracy and capitalism, which is variously described. I describe it as corpocracy, and many others would describe it as neoliberalism, and there are other words. But just there's the widely acclaimed Professor Sheldon Wolin. He's professor of politics emeritus at Princeton University, and he coined the term inverted totalitarianism. And Chris Hedges, who's a renowned author and Pulitzer Prize winner and longtime New York Times writer, Chris Hedges had this to say: much like the late Roman Republic, you still have the facade, the iconography, the language, the institutions of an open society, of a democratic state, but internally, corporations have seized all the levers of power to render the citizen impotent. And he goes on, anytime a cabal seizes power, whether it is monarchical, communist, fascist, or corporate, it redirects all of the systems of government and institutions towards its own empowerment and enrichment. The result is political paralysis. The political system seizes up. It no longer responds to the rights and legitimate grievances of the citizenry, and in fact extracts more and more out of a population that is already under deep stress. Now, thank you for allowing me to come in for a couple of minutes with that quote, because I really think that goes to the root and the core of all the issues we're having across all sectors. Now, going back to yes, I did indeed. I published a report in September 2015 called the Beer, Beef, Bread Report, and it was very much a macroeconomic report. For example, I found, and in fairness to the people I interviewed, dozens of people, they were all very frank with me because I guaranteed them confidentiality. And I found on the input side that there were cartels in operation on things like animal feedstuff, fertilizer, veterinary pharmaceuticals. They were hideously expensive in Ireland. So, so our primary producers are immediately at a disadvantage because they have to pay these basically supernormal input costs. So that was one of the areas I found. But in looking at how dominant the beef producers are, producers are, there's only a few of them. I came across incredible amounts of political capture. And, I looked, and then I further looked at, what happens to the animal that the farmer raises. And he brings the farmer to the beef processor to be slaughtered. And in fact, in Ireland, and I presume it's probably much the same anywhere else, in Ireland, the farmer gets paid for approximately 50% of the weight of the animal that he brings to the processor. He doesn't get paid anything for the other 50%, which traditionally people might have called waste. But in actual fact, it's not waste. The 50%, this is laughable, the 50% that the farmer is not getting paid for is actually the most valuable part of the animal. And, it's colloquially called the fifth quarter, because we all know the 4 quarters which we tend to eat as meat. But the fifth quarter, as I say, it accounts for 50% of the animal's weight. And it includes things like the heart, the liver, the kidneys, the tongue, the stomach, the skirt, tripe, intestine, tail, embryonic fluids, horns, head, ears, glands. All of these things are valuable. And as I say, farmers don't get paid for them. But, nowadays, the fifth quarter is used in the making of pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, household and industrial goods. For example, ointments, binders for plaster and asphalt, footballs, lubricants, soaps, lipsticks, face and hand creams, and ingredients for explosives are produced from the inedible fats from beef. Also, in addition, the fatty acids are used in the production of chemicals, biodegradable detergents, pesticides, and flotation agents. Bones, horns, and hooves are used to make buttons, bone china, piano keys, glues, and fertilizer. Also gelatin for photographic film, paper, wallpaper, sandpaper, combs, toothbrushes, and violin string. And wait for it, more than 100 individual drugs, including insulin, are derived from cattle. So hold on a minute, what's going on here?
So really, yeah. So really, I mean, the take home from that, fantastic. That very, very, not quite exhaustive, but it's a significant list. Is that any conversation about sustainability, and I know in week 4, I mean, we covered wool and sustainability. Any genuine conversation, Seamus, about sustainability, really has to include, let's say broadly ruminants, but really has to include cattle.
Absolutely. Well, like we're just getting one side of the story here, as far as I can see nowadays. I mean, cattle and sheep and pork are, of course, they're fundamental to society. They're fundamental to feeding society and have always been for thousands of years. And suddenly, a lot of people are trying to change the entire agenda and trying, in many respects, to wipe out the production of animal foods. I understand why some people go with that, but I mean, I just can't see it as being realistic. There are issues with regard to animal husbandry, animal welfare, absolutely, and these issues need to be dealt with, but not at the expense of cutting out animals. I actually listened to something that Peter had been speaking about at some stage in the US, and he said, if I am right, he said that CO2 emissions from the agri sector in the US amounted to 9%, and of that, he said that livestock accounted for just 4% and beef for just 2%. So here we are in Ireland. We want to wipe out half of our beef herd for almost negligible gains, and that doesn't take into account the sequestration of CO2 that can be done on farms. I think there's an inaccurate, ill-informed narrative being given to us all, and we need some very sensible debate on the way forward. And the way forward to me is definitely we must look at the value chain in agriculture, and we must restructure it. What has happened is, the corporations have taken over the major part of the value chain, and they suppress farmers. They suppress the price to give them. This happens in the US equally as it happens over here in Ireland. And there's a few things we need to get our head around. Trade agreements. We hear about all these trade agreements, and corporate lawyers praise them and say trade is essential. But of course, trade is essential. But it's what type of trade we have. And if you take the CETA agreement, which is the European Canadian trade deal, I mean, that deal, and the Green Party, Eamon Ryan, spoke vehemently against that deal when he was in opposition, and now when he's in power, he wants to ratify it. But you must remember, and this is a factor. This is why I traveled to America, and this is why I went to conferences to learn what's happening on both sides. So in these trade deals, what happens is corporations benefit, and corporations are interested in one thing: not your health, or not quality, profit. And one of the ways of getting profit is to suppress primary producers. And this is what's happening in the States. This is what's happening in Canada. This is what's happening in Ireland and in Europe. And it's absolutely wrong. So these trade deals are not benefiting the socio-economy. They are benefiting giant corporations. There's a big difference. There will always be trade, but it doesn't have to be this type of trade. So like what I work, and I have assisted many different groups in looking at this whole agri sector. As far as I'm concerned, the Irish government, the present government, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil as well, in the past, these people are completely captured by the body corporate, by lobbyists. And if you look at Brussels, and I'll finish on this, Brussels has 48,000 lobbyists. And these lobbyists are not lobbying for you or me or Joe Citizen. These are corporate lobbyists. And these are the people that are running the European Union. 48,000 corporate lobbyists, and we have a pretense of democracy. So like we need to restructure, we need to introduce the cooperatives again, and this time make them unsellable to corporations. We've given away all our good cooperatives to corporations. We need to go back, we need to examine the value chain, we need to open up cooperatives, and we need to process the fifth quarter, and that must be done by farmers, not by global corporations.
That's a very, very good, that's a really rich contribution, Seamus, and I mean, thank you very much. And actually, I'm quite surprised. I didn't realize there were 48,000 lobbyists in Brussels, because I think a stat that I heard a number of years ago was that there were, in terms of EU civil servants, I think there are, now I could be wrong, is it 38,000 civil servants? So there's actually more lobbyists in Brussels than EU civil servants. I mean, that's quite staggering.
But they're figures that have been unearthed by no less than Transparency International. These figures can be stood over.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but just on that, Seamus, I know you were saying you went to the US, and I mean, if our viewers are of a mind, there was a wonderful talk and a wonderful gentleman, he's a Professor Emeritus, John Eichert, and I think I was pronounced his name correctly. And I know you went to Kansas City, Seamus, to the Organization of Competitive Markets, and John gave a talk at that. And it is searchable on YouTube. Wonderful gentleman. And he actually has, I mean, I've since seen more of his contributions on YouTube, but what he has to say at almost 80 years of age or over 80 years of age, in terms of and having had a lifetime's experience in US agriculture and outside the US is absolutely worth looking at on YouTube. Seamus, that's a very, very nice contribution, and I'm actually going to segue back to Peter, Seamus, and I just want to pick up on something that you touched on with Peter. Peter, in terms of the and again, I did have another question in mind, but again, it's free form, so you know, I've just picked up on something Seamus has said, and I'll interject with this question. In terms of the fifth quarter, I'm thinking in terms of organ meats. You know, we see it here. I think in Ireland the figure is about 10% of meat sales go through, you know, your small family butcher, you know, on the high street, and I think about 90% is through large multiples, you know, your big box stores or your retailers like Tesco and so on, and. You know, I just wonder, you know, there's been a real decline in consumption of organ meats over the last few years. How much nutrition are we missing out on?
Oh, well, I would say that people have been missing out on a tremendous amount of nutrition across the board, whether it's muscle meat or organ meat. I think that we have far better quality evidence of the harm that comes from eating too little animal source foods than we do from harm coming from too much. The harm from too much is another, I'll just call it myth. It's a part of the narrative. So when there's interesting information suggesting that what we eat influences how much we eat. And today, I don't know about Ireland, I won't judge. In the US, we have a real problem with metabolic illness, one of which is obesity. But this is a global phenomenon. And so earlier I mentioned having a more holistic conversation. You mentioned sustainability. If we don't look at societal, economic, as well as environmental issues, we're not having an honest conversation about sustainability. We're having some other kind of conversation. Everything's trade-offs, everything's, you know, cost and benefit analysis, and it's hard to do that kind of work. But here's one for you that I got from a colleague, that the average American type 2 diabetic consumes the equivalent in pharmaceuticals to the emissions produced by a car. a year. Oh, okay. So now let's see if we're right, and eating more animal source food, less processed plant source food lowers the incidence of type 2 diabetes, can produce drug-free remission from type 2 diabetes, which is being shown in the research. If we could expand that across the entire population, that would result in a reduction in emissions due to the reduction in pharmaceuticals. And that reduction would be equivalent to the amount of carbon sequestered by forests the size of somewhere between Colorado and Oregon, like the 18th largest state in the nation. This is significant, but we don't think about it, right? We only look at emissions from ruminant animals, and those numbers need to be talked about. The nature of those emissions need to be talked about because they're very different than what's produced when we burn fossil fuel to grow vegetables and cereals and those sorts of foodstuffs. So this is a very complicated space, and part of this is also to acknowledge that we have a range of social and economic realities amongst consumers. And so whatever people can afford is what I encourage them to buy and to enjoy, whatever's appropriate to their family background. We look globally, and we realize that almost a quarter of children globally, 5 years and under, are stunted due to a lack of animal source food in their diet. The WHO, the UNICEF, both are saying that animal source foods are the best foods to provide the essential nutrients for children from 6 to 23 months. And yet 59% of children globally are not eating eggs, dairy, meat, or seafood. And so these sorts of issues become driving for me to push back against the narratives and this mythology. So if people are replacing animal source food with plant source food, which we've been told to do, then they're getting less nutrition than they need.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a really rich, that's just absolutely chock full of really high impact information, Peter. Conceptually, I'm aware of it, but I'm staggered. The 18th largest state. It really does highlight just how ecologically damaging, as well as in terms of metabolically damaging, that the pharmaceutical sector is actually, in lieu of just for want of better nutrition, I suppose you might say. And again, one can see a kind of a whole series of related, could I say, with my cynical hat on, a related thread of corporate incentives in some ways.
Well, Seamus mentioned the emissions from all of agriculture, and EPA in the United States Environmental Protection Agency releases a source and sink budget periodically. I think it's annually. The latest data shows that if you look at the agriculture, forestry, and land use change sector, that gets you somewhere in that 10% or so of total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions for the US. But that sector today is sequestering an amount that's equal to 12% of the total, right? So again, the public perception versus the reality are very, very different. The US healthcare industry has been, by some estimates, something like 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions just to the healthcare industry. The cost due to obesity, direct and indirect, is somewhere around 9% of GDP value in the US. All of farm and ranch gate value is 1. The entire food industry sector, which would include the farm and ranch gate value, is 5. So the cost of malnutrition, understanding that obesity is a form of malnutrition, that cost is like twice the food value. So this begins to ripple out into ways that aren't currently being considered in the conversation. I'm very happy to have conversations with people who are sincerely interested in sustainable food systems, who are sincerely interested in improving nutrition in the US and globally. Unfortunately, too often that's used as a cover for other conversations. So I want people to become more aware of is, let's agree, let's find points of agreement, that we should all agree on achieving adequate essential nutrition, and we should also agree on attaining or maintaining metabolic health. There are lots of conversations under each of those headings, but if we find ourselves talking to somebody that doesn't agree with those, then we should probably move on, because it's not a sincere conversation at that point.
Again, I mean, that's, what can I say, Peter? I mean, that's a rich contribution there. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's guests on Grassroots are all the way from Oregon on the west coast of the United States. We have Dr. Peter Bellerstadt, and from the, I've said no less lovely Strand Hill in County Sligo, we have Seamus May. Peter, I'm going to come back to yourself now. I'm just in terms of management. I am going to go back to Seamus in a moment, but I might just touch on broadly something on to do with ruminant nutrition, if that's okay. And there's another issue, that kind of a burning question that I have in relation to welfare and what's happening in Oregon at the moment. But before we come to that, you know, you've given us a really rich contribution in terms of, let's talk about, or let's refer to it as, you know, issues that are extant in developed economies, you know, like Ireland, like the UK, like most of Europe, the US, North America. How important in terms of, and I'm trying to sort of, you know, tease out the issues about corporatization and control of resources. How important, for example, in developing economies are ruminants in terms of, you know, for your small peasant farmers and smallholders, not just in terms of sort of the nutrition, which is important, and the cycling of nutrients, and that kind of, if I could say, buffer against hunger and so on. How important, just merely in terms of autonomy in developing economies, are ruminants?
Well, the vast majority, let me start again. The majority, so more than 50% of the world's cereals, beef, lamb, are produced on small mixed, you know, smallholder farms globally. So to the extent that those small producers are not getting access to fair compensation for their product, it's a huge problem. In terms of some parts of the world, livestock are a significant source of social improvement. Some societies, they may be the only property that women can own and control. And so this is a very complicated issue that I'm just an agronomist. I don't understand these other things. I recognize them. People need to check into organizations like ILRI, which is working to sustainably to increase the sustainable animal source food production for people in the low and middle income countries. If we look at the developing countries versus US, for example, US intensity of emissions is somewhere around 12 kg of CO2 equivalent per kg of beef. That's somewhere in ballpark. If I go to places like Zimbabwe, it's 70 kg of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of beef. I think Brazil has 3 times the number of cattle of the US, but they produce less beef. So when I talk about efficiency, that efficiency is going to be reflected in a lowered impact. And so it's a complicated but achievable goal to, as I said, improve the productivity and efficiency of ruminant animal agriculture globally. Right now, in the world, the majority of humanity's calories come from plants, and the majority of humanity's protein, in quotes, because it's not even real protein, it's crude protein, comes from plants. And so that's the problem. We need to get the middle and low income countries to the point where they have access to the animal source foods that will help them develop properly in terms of cognitive behavior, in terms of physical health. And I'm going to put that on the scale next to any other conversation. And that's the perspective that I'm coming from.
Oh, that's fantastic, Peter. Thank you so much. And Seamus, to come to yourself, a very similar question, if not the same question to yourself. In terms of our own indigenous socio-economy, Seamus, the narrative here, I'm thinking particularly in terms of agriculture, but the narrative here is, look, we're an exporting nation. There doesn't seem to be, if you look, for example, at the UK, one can imagine where food security for an island which is about 3 times the size of Ireland, but with over 10 times the population, food security is a key tenet of national security. It doesn't seem to be the case here. Has there been not enough emphasis on our own indigenous socio-economy, even to the extent that, a bellwether of that is the fact that, the political imperative now seems to be swinging towards, let's cut the suckler herd. And I mean, people don't, the political knowledge and awareness of all of those other co-benefits, like, mental health, social benefits, there's just no awareness of that. Can you just maybe tease out some of those issues for us, please, Seamus?
Well, it's very easy to tease them out, because you go back to the 48,000 lobbyists in Brussels, and you have a similar proportion here in Ireland. And everything at government level is being done in the corporate interest, and very, very little is being done in the public interest. And that is the problem. And I said that, Peter and myself, we might cross, where we're coming might cross, and we have crossed. Because, for example, Peter was talking about obesity. And, part of my beer, beef and bread report, the bread was very important. And, we are, as far as the research that I did, I didn't actually, make a statement on it. I set out the two sides of the issue, and we are making bread through an industrial process. It's called the Corleywood bread process, and that bread is seriously unhealthy. We need to, because the way the wheat and the grain is milled takes out all the goodness out of the grain, and we put back in enzymes, and we put in all kinds of things that aren't even have to be put on labels. Now, I won't go into greater detail, but it is all laid out in great detail in my report. That's the bread part of it. And, there was a tacit acknowledgement, and I'm going to say a word or two about Bord Bia and Teagasc. Now, there was a tacit acknowledgement by Bord Bia about the quality of the bread. And what they said was, this is back, I think, in 2015, and they said that the bread sector, 2% plus value growth expected for the category. This is for bread. This is the staple diet, like rice is in the Far East. But Bord Bia said, issues around health and health perceptions of category will severely dent this, if not managed. Now, what is all that about? Why can't we go back? Because there's huge obesity issues in Ireland, and the bread we're eating is it's not everything, but it is a large part of it. Why can't we go back to growing our own wheat and barley? And why can't we go to stone grinding the flour, which was the way it was done in the past? And why can't we have little stone grinding mills all over the country? And why can't we have little bakeries in every town and village in the country producing healthy food? Not this crap that we're eating. So that's just one example, and you know, it seems that the agricultural media, for whatever reason, they wanted to bypass and refuse to give any publicity or report on what I've done in my report, and it's very sad. So, you know, I say, isn't it great to have people like Peter and all the other people that are not vested interests, that are just experts, that are people that care and that are passionate? Isn't it great to have those on this show? But, you know, why aren't these people in Dáil Éireann, and why aren't these people on mainstream media? Like, we're not being told the truth anywhere along the way. And it's affecting people's lives. It's affecting people's health. So, you know.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful contribution, Seamus. I mean, we are aware of a lot of the issues. I don't have I don't have figures, but I think, and this is just for Peter as well. I think, you know, we're not too far behind the US in terms of obesity statistics. I think we're up near the top of the league. You know, if you look at league tables, we're up near the top of the league ourselves in the UK. We're near the top of the European League tables in terms of the proportion of the population who are considered obese. And I think that's on the basis of the BMI. I'm not absolutely sure how it's measured currently. But no, Seamus, there definitely are issues that you've touched on. And I mean, you know, thanks for making some of those key points where, you know, we really, you know, food security is a massive issue for us. And again, for Peter, I mean, I'm not sure, a huge proportion, I'm not sure, again, I don't have the figures to hand, but we're actually importing wheat from the Canadian prairies, and we're getting a lot of wheat from East Anglia. And it's an issue we plan to touch on if we have another series of, or when we have another series of grassroots later in the year. But Seamus, thanks very much for that contribution. I'm kind of going to pivot a bit more towards Peter now, and maybe just if I can maybe pivot a bit towards maybe more the ruminant nutrition, Peter, in terms of, and you'll know this from your experience as a forage agronomist. Coming from the Irish perspective, I mean, we hear a lot about grass-based and grass-fed ruminant agriculture. And for ourselves in Regenerative Farming Ireland, what we're saying is that there are other ways of producing it rather than, you know, the if you will, the monocrop nitrogen-dependent grasses. Our major issue, I think, it tends to be, and again, it's comparative. I mean, we're not anywhere near other parts of the world, but reactive nitrogen in the environment is probably our biggest issue, and it goes back to that quote from Russ Conser: it's not the cow, it's the how. Are there any kind of developments and in terms of breeding of grasses or breeding of forages, which are, you know, tending towards less reliance on let's say geochemical nitrogen, or what are you seeing in relation to any increased emphasis on phytodiversity in swards?
Well, there are a number of issues that you could tease out. One might be if you had a deeper rooted plant that could exploit more of the soil's profile than, say, a shallower rooted plant. I'm thinking something more like tall fescue than perennial ryegrass. We grow perennial ryegrass because of very high feed quality. We can improve the feed quality of tall fescue. Maybe we could scavenge some nutrients from lower down. We can certainly do things in terms of nutrient application timing, and testing to make sure that we're putting on adequate but not excessive amounts. One of the issues that we see in parts of the US is a lot of the poultry litter, which is the product of the poultry, meat production. That poultry litter is used as a fertilizer source for beef pasture. but they're doing it primarily to hit nitrogen targets, but it's exceeding their phosphorus needs. And so then that creates a potential surface water problem. So there's a number of things. Yes, absolutely, the incorporation of legumes. I've been speaking to a number of my forage agronomist teachers and fellow students over the years, and you go back a generation, and we were dealing in the 50s and 60s with 5 cents a pound nitrogen. Well, those days are gone forever. But back in those days, the cost that it would take to produce the legume into some of these soils and systems wasn't worth it. They could just put on the 5 cents a pound nitrogen. And so those days are gone. Now we have to figure out how to incorporate legumes that will stick in those different environments. And the United States is a big country. We've got lots of different ecosystems to plug these plants into. So there's one thing I just want to push back a little bit, because I've heard that it's not the cow, it's the how. And this can lead us into another point that you had raised earlier. The truth is, for some small, well-financed, very vocal minority within today's population, it's not the how, it's the that matters. The mere fact that you're raising livestock, the mere fact that you're eating animal source food is what they are against. And the simple fact is, some of these people are striving to eliminate animal agriculture. And they think that they can, or at least they talk as if they think that you could do that and still have sustainable food systems. And you can't. There is no sustainable food system without livestock, and especially ruminant animal agriculture. And these are absurdities that are entertained by relatively wealthy, relatively comfortable people who are well removed from the rural reality. They can order their food from Amazon or what have you. I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but they don't have that contact with how animal agriculture and plant agriculture are integrated.
Absolutely. No, I'm really glad you brought that up, Peter, because, and I am being slightly opportunistic, but aware that you're based in Oregon, Peter, I couldn't let the opportunity slip to ask you, sort of, because you're actually there, you're on the ground, you're closer to, could I say, ground zero. The proposed legislation, I have it here, that I think is at some point or at some stage going through the Oregon State Legislature, and it's called the Abuse, Neglect and Assault Exemption Modification and Improvement Act. And I think it was first proposed in November 2020. And I'm reading headlines, and one or two people have said to me, "Oh my God, that they're going to ban animal agriculture and as well as hunting and fishing in Oregon." And what I did was I went and I got the actual the PDF of the actual text of the proposed legislation, and I read through it. And at one point there's a reference to I think licensed veterinary practitioners, and the cynic in me wonders, is it, are there mechanisms built into it? And again, not being a legal expert, to provide workarounds for corporates where, your small family farmer who might have an animal science qualification or an ag qualification, but not a licensed veterinary qualification, that they're going to be disproportionately hit. And I just wonder, again, what's the current status, or what's the word on the ground about that, Peter?
Well, remarkably, there's very little word on the ground in Oregon. I frankly have heard more about a voter initiative petition in Colorado. So that all being said, in some of these proposed legislations, they want to redefine artificial insemination as a sexual act with an animal. Okay. In other parts, they want to say that you can't slaughter an animal until it's lived 25% of its natural life, to be defined by them. And natural, according to who? So what you can see there is an absolute attack on animal source food production, regardless of size. Now, clearly, if they're going to say with good conscience and, that you must have a licensed veterinarian oversee these things, clearly that's going to be a far bigger economic burden on a small producer than on a large producer. But in the United States, I think the average cow-calf cow herd size in beef is something on the order of 30 to 40 head. So that's who this is going to impact, is the average producer. But again, I don't think that this is sincere in its stated purpose. I think that this is intended to eliminate animal agriculture.
Wow, I mean, again, that's my reading of it. To make it de facto, as awkward as possible, to make it, infeasible. That's my read on it. And again, we could speculate. We could spend some time wondering about the thought processes of the minds that come up with these thoughts. But I mean, there's really not much. I can't think of anything else to say on that. It is quite bizarre. But Peter, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, it's been a privilege and an absolute pleasure to have you on the show tonight. Last word to Seamus. Seamus, if I can just come in there and maybe just to get a comment from you in terms of some of that proposed legislation. What's your read on that in the context of corporatization?
I've been listening with great interest to Peter. Fabulous. Let's just talk about hypocrisy for a moment. We're looking at possibly with the desecration of the beef sector in Ireland, possibly reducing our CO2 emissions by 1%. That's on a good day, maybe. Now, we're talking about signing a deal with South America, with the Mercosur deal. So we're going to bring shipping beef. They're burning down rainforests to produce more beef to ship it up to Europe. I mean, that's insane. And bringing beef from Canada to Europe is insane. How much CO2 emissions are being produced? And let's get really into hypocrisy here now. Let's talk about data centers. Data centers are massive users of electricity. A couple of years ago, I read a report that the entire data storage, the data centers in the US, the amount of electricity they used just for those storage facilities was 40% more than the entire UK usage of electricity. And Ireland is prostituting itself to data centers. So let's get real. Let's talk about data centers. Let's talk about how much CO2 emissions and how much power and everything is required for data centers before we start, again, desecrating the rural economy and desecrating our beef sector. And also, maybe for a bit of balance, let's look at the difference between the CO2 emissions in the dairy sector as against the beef sector. So what I would say, there's a long conversation to be had, and fair play to you, Peter, fair play to the Irish Inquiry for facilitating people of the calibre that I've seen over the last number of weeks talking about various issues in agriculture, and I feel very humble to be among them, but I thank you for bringing me on the show. Thank you very much.
Absolutely no problem, Seamus. It's a pleasure to have you on anytime because you're doing some really fantastic work. Seamus, thank you so much for a wonderful contribution. And you have really highlighted something there in terms of the the proposed or the likely proliferation of data centers, which, are going to use a huge amount of electricity. And, I have speculated in the past that I think Simon Coveney, and for Peter, that's our Foreign Affairs Minister, he signed a deal, I think, with the French government it was reported in, I think it was Q3 2019, where we're going to tap into French nuclear energy or electricity generation. And I suspect that's to have a more reliable source of power for data centers and for, the pharmaceutical sector around Ringaskiddy and for other, Intel and semiconductors and so on. So again, there's a very a big conversation and an impactful and hopefully a meaningful conversation to be had there, which hopefully we will cover in future seasons of grassroots. Where we can actually sort of push back against the villainization of agriculture and the villainization of ruminants and cows in particular. Ladies and gentlemen, we're really pushing against the wire here this evening. We're at an hour and 10 minutes. Yeah. And Seamus, you just want to come in again, Seamus?
No, just 1 second. Just to maybe mention to viewers that I have done a TED Talk titled Ireland, Democracy or Hypocrisy, which has been very well received, and I think people might be interested in listening to it. I've also done an interview called Banking, Building and Beef, the Cozy Cabal in Ireland. And as well as that, obviously, my Beer, Beef, Bread report. So if any viewers want to have a listen or a look at any of these things, they can contact me. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter and Facebook. I think it might complement some of what was being said by both Peter and I tonight.
Oh, fantastic. And actually, that just reminds me, Peter, just to come back to yourself for the final word, where can people find your work? Where can they go to delve more into what you're talking about, what you've informed us about with all of those rich contributions this evening?
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Seamus. I really appreciated hearing you tonight. You can find me all over social media. There's not that many Bellerstadts out there. And if you find them, they may be kin, so let me know. You can find me on YouTube by name. You can find me on Twitter at grass-based, one word, Instagram, same. You can find me at grass-based health on Facebook.
Peter, that's fantastic. And to our viewers, and having looked at, and having followed you for a number of years, Peter, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege and delightful to finally meet you. And thank you so much for coming on the show and making a wonderful contribution all the way, ladies and gentlemen, from Oregon on the west coast of the US. So that's our first United States guest, ladies and gentlemen, and hopefully we'll have many more. Peter, will you come back on the show with us again, possibly at some stage in the future?
I'd be happy to, please.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. And yourself, Seamus. I mean, we'll be seeing you around anyway. No doubt.
Anytime. Yeah, we're only starting.
Great stuff, Seamus. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, really, that's, that's a very, very great. That's a great show this evening. I mean, that's been, a very intense, 1 hour and almost 15 minutes. But to our two guests tonight, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Peter Bellerstadt from Oregon in the US and to Seamus May from Sligo in the northwest of Ireland, who have both contributed really, really richly to the conversation this evening. I'd like to thank them very much for giving up of their time freely tonight. Or in Peter's case, it's just past 2 p.m. Pacific time on the US West Coast. So thanks for giving up your lunch, Peter. I mean, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Go to Mila Mahagat, as we say. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, again, just some housekeeping before we go. You can watch us back. Please feel free to make comments, suggestions, recommendations. All comments welcome. I see we have at least one vegan comment in the comment section. And look, please do. I mean, we're about having this free and open discussion and actually having a mature debate and a mature conversation so that we can maybe reach some kind of consensus. Ladies and gentlemen, that really is it for tonight. And I think that's it. Just to the Irish Inquiry and Stephen and all the backroom team for facilitating the conversation. It takes a lot of work to get the programme to air, ladies and gentlemen. We'd really like to say thank you to them and to you, our audience. We'd like to thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you'll make this a regular Wednesday night slot. We have 2 more episodes left in this, the first season of Grassroots. But until next week, go mé dras le chéile a ríis an teachtan seachún, slán go fóil agus bannachtaí oribh go léir. From Grassroots, good night.